Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Hope and Lies by C.H. Lynn, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, 70 years ago beyond the Gray Star military compound wall. The sun shone bright across the early morning sky, and a chill cut the air. Boots were necessary to walk across the dew-coated fields without soaking one's pants to the knee. In the distance, a long wall separated the wilderness from the elite. Skyscrapers coated in glass and white concrete peeked out from the center of the city. The rising sun glinted across the windows, blinding those who stared too long. A truck sporting the emblem of a Gray Star medical unit idled on the gravel road halfway between the city and the forest. The trees encroached slowly. It had been many decades since men thrived from destroying them. It would be many decades more before those who remained grew concerned about the dangers of the wilderness. The Gray Stars and their allies had other worries at the moment. The convoy truck honked a whiny horn, and a couple standing a few feet away parted. The shorter of the two waved a hand in the direction of the med unit transport. Then she turned back and shook her head as the man opened his mouth. Maybelle pressed a delicate finger to Ben's lips. "Don't. I'll see you soon, I promise." I don't like you going out again, not after last time." She sighed, brushing a hand through her short black hair, and pulled her thin navy jacket tighter around her torso. "I'm not going because I want to. It's my assignment." "I can get you out of it," Ben murmured through pale lips. Maybelle rolled her eyes. She glanced at the truck. They had been on their way when Ben flagged them down. Her unit commander was not pleased with the delay, but Ben outranked him. "A little late for that, don't you think?" He ran a hand across his face, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Yeah, I suppose you're right. Take this with you, for me." He pressed a golden locket etched with ornate, detailed lines into her hands. She took it, glancing up at him. "I didn't want to bring it on a mission. It's so beautiful." "It'll make you think of me while you're out there. If anything goes wrong," Ben's square jaw tightened, "I'll be there for you. Be careful, all right?" "I'll see you soon." Maybelle went on her toes to peck his cheek, then turned without another word and jogged to the truck. She slipped the chain, thicker than the jewelry she was used to, over her head. The high cheekboned, strong-jawed, immaculately eyebrowed, dark brown head of Kate popped out through the opening in the tarp that protected those riding in the bed from the elements. "Took you long enough," she said with a wry grin. We ready to go yet?" "Yes." Kate reached out a hand. Maybelle grasped it, and her friend pulled her up. Their unit commander, a gruff, weathered man with gray hair and a constant, severe expression, slammed a palm on the window to the cab. The truck lurched forward. A dozen people sat comfortably along the thick benches lining either side of the truck bed. The 6 members of the Gray Star medical unit with their packed medical bags, and the Black Star security force with their long, heavy plasma guns. "What did he want?" Kate asked as the 2 women settled into the seats near the tarp flap. "Just to say bye and give me something." Kate raised an eyebrow. Maybelle pulled the chain forward and showed Kate the locket. "He gave it to me last night, but I left it in my dorm." "He stopped the truck just to bring you a locket?" "Yeah, I think he's worried after last time." Maybelle clenched her jaw, and Kate's gaze fell. Their last mission, also their first mission, had been an utter failure. It's hard to heal people who are already dead. And by the time they'd arrived at the Black Star outpost, everyone had been dead. "I'll talk to him when we get back. He can't," she sighed. "If things are going to get serious between us, he can't pull rank that way." "Serious? Haven't they already gotten serious? He spent the night in your room last week." Maybelle gave Kate a significant "shut up" look. "That was because of the nightmares. Nothing happened." Kate unsuccessfully covered a mischievous grin. "Whatever you say." "I love you like a sister, but please stop talking." Kate raised her hands in defeat and looked away. Maybelle leaned back. The truck went over a bump. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. After almost 30 years of friendship, Kate still didn't know how to hold her tongue. It had gotten the 2 of them in trouble more times than Maybelle could count. Her temple itched. She reached a manicured finger and scratched at the place where her skin met the circular gemstone embedded in the soft space between her eye and hairline. Once she scratched the itch away, she absent-mindedly stroked the cut gray stone barely larger than her comm piece. Recalling the long list of research transmissions she still needed to listen to, Maybelle pulled the small black device from her pocket and tucked it into her ear. She took out a piece of glass the size of her ID card, tapped on the screen for a moment, and turned up the volume as the truck's engine revved. They were going up an incline. Her heartbeat quickened, as it always did when they went into the mountains. She took a deep breath and concentrated on the low female voice dripping like honey into her left ear. Trial number 4629. Subject responded positively to the first series of injections. Fetus reached 16 weeks. A heavy sigh. The miscarriage was worse than last time. I have concerns about the rate of injections and the priorities of my superiors. The mother must remain healthy during the process. The truck hit another bump and Kate grabbed Maybelle's knee. Gray eyes met. Maybelle took her friend's hand and held it as they rumbled through the forest, the doctor's voice still going over results from the latest tests. The med truck jerked to a stop. They reversed, turned, and moved down the dirt road they had missed. "We're a few minutes out," the unit commander said. Maybelle pulled her med bag between her legs and double-checked the contents. Kate clenched and unclenched her hands. After a few sharp turns, the truck stopped. The 6 members of the security force went first, returning quickly to give the all-clear for the Gray Stars. Maybelle and Kate jumped from the bed. The Black Star recruit who had driven hurried around the side of the truck and unloaded their bags. Maybelle picked up hers and waited for Kate. Kate, dark braids dancing around her shoulders, flashed a grin at the Black Star. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, fresh from training and not used to working with Gray Stars yet. His wide blue eyes watched Kate's every move. A ripple went through the air, a fluctuation that Maybelle noticed and the Black Star did not. She shot Kate a dark look as the rookie lunged forward. "Let me!" He picked up her bag, his eyes wide, his hands fumbling in his hurry to please. "Can't you turn it off once in a while?" Maybelle muttered as Kate walked by. "It's harmless. They like the feeling." Kate waved a hand loftily through the air. "It's manipulative." Kate shook her head and marched away, calling over her shoulder, "We're meant to use our gift to make life easier." Something heavy and unpleasant thunked in the pit of Maybelle's stomach as the Black Star scurried behind her friend. She grimaced and followed them, gripping the strap of her own bag between pale fingers. Leaves crunched under their feet. Twigs snapped with each step. But beyond the sounds made by the med unit, the forest was unnervingly silent. No birds zipped through the trees, no rodents danced under the brush. Maybelle swallowed. The unpleasant feeling in her stomach moved up to her chest. The path ended suddenly, dumping the group in a clearing. Kate gasped. A shudder went through Maybelle. Her throat clenched and her ears rang. The Black Star dropped the bag he carried, turned around, and emptied the contents of his stomach behind a bush. Blood. It dripped from the trees, auburn and brown leaves speckled with crimson. Red splattered the barracks wall, small spots followed by gentle drips, and finally huge splashes coated the white paint. The stench worked its way into Maybelle's nose, through her throat and to her tongue. The metallic taste of the air had her doubled over, swallowing repeatedly to avoid throwing up. The clearing was carved out of a dense section of forest. The trees surrounding them towered high, letting in only the occasional beam of direct sunlight. 3 buildings, a mess hall, a barracks for the Black Star trainees, and housing for the Gray Star instructors, sat against 3 sides of the woods. The barracks was the largest, sleeping 40 Black Stars fresh from the coating. They were all dead. Their bodies littered the training field. The stench of blood, soot, and burned flesh engulfed the air. Tears welled in Maybelle's eyes. A shudder racked her body, and her hands shook before she clenched them into white-knuckled fists. These Black Stars were practically children, 20-year-olds, barely out of school, the gemstones on their temples hardly used to being that shiny black color. A girl lay a few feet away. Her body was twisted and closer than the rest, as though she had been running for the path before being struck down. The gemstone on her right temple was barely visible beneath strands of blonde hair, stuck to the blood matted across her face. A jagged slice ran from the top of her eyebrow and down past her jaw. It cut straight through her brilliant blue eye, leaving a glassy, empty stare that Maybelle could not break from. After a moment, tears cascading down her cheeks, Maybelle turned away. She met Kate's gaze and saw her own fear reflected in their dark depths. They couldn't win this war if the rebels kept murdering new recruits. A sharp voice broke her out of the despair encompassing her mind. "Look for survivors," the unit commander barked. She clenched her jaw and looked closer at the bodies. Some were moving. As the ringing in her ears diminished, she heard the moans of the injured. She rushed forward. Movement to her right pulled her attention. A young man, another Black Star with sandy hair and thin arms, opened his mouth and closed it over and over. She knelt and rummaged through her bag. His forehead was split open, blood dribbling down his cheek. He kept trying to speak. Maybelle put a gentle finger to his lips. "Shh, it's all right. I'm here. I've got you." She pulled a small canister from the bag, popped the lid, and sprayed it directly into his wound. He cried out in pain. Once the cut was disinfected, Maybell used a second canister to spray foam into the slice. It would only take a few moments for the inflamed red swelling to reduce back to its normal size and color. His cry turned into a soft whimper. She squeezed his shoulder, meeting his eye and speaking in a low voice. This will cool and numb the wound, and it should start the healing process. I'm going to wrap you up, then we'll get you home, all right? He didn't answer, but there was less fear in his gaze. She glanced back and noted the Black Star rookie who had accompanied their med unit was still crouched over next to the bush. Come help me get him up. We should get him into the truck. The boy quivered, his gaze fixed on the shredded limb a few feet away. Hey, Maybell snapped. His eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath, concentrated, and a familiar warmth filled her chest. As she exhaled, the air between herself and the rookie warped just enough to bend the light filtering through the trees. The Black Star stood, his face suddenly alert. He went to her, ready to please, needing to do whatever was necessary to keep her happy. How can I help? He asked, his voice weak but determined. Get this one to the truck, then come back. He gave a sharp nod and gently helped the injured boy stand. They both hesitated for a moment, wearing matching expressions of rapture and awe. Maybell clenched her jaw and turned away. Kate may enjoy having people stare at her with that unwavering loyalty and admiration, but it made Maybell uncomfortable. It didn't feel real to her. Perhaps because it wasn't. She picked her way through the bodies, searching for another injured person. Around her and further in the clearing, the rest of the med unit was doing the same. Kate knelt near the trees over a body not wearing the standard trainee tactical gear. Our own come first, another member of the unit called to her, not unkindly. Kate stood and walked toward the center of the clearing, though her face wore a troubled expression. She bent again, this time at the body of a trainee, when the unit commander started toward her, his face contorted in contempt and derision. Gray stars before black, he snapped. You can't be that. He froze, his words hanging in the air. A spurt of red blossomed on the chest of his tan uniform. He looked down. He fell. Kate screamed. Maybell stood, rooted to the ground, as figures appeared from between the trees. Men and women surrounded them, guns drawn. Their clothes were mismatched, hardly in uniforms, but each bore their insignia, a single red handprint. That handprint had haunted Maybell's nightmares since the start of the uprising. Several things happened at once. The Black Stars traveling with the med unit raised their plasma guns. They traded half a dozen shots before being struck down. Old-fashioned weapons with crude metal projectiles that ripped apart flesh slaughtered them where they stood. The Black Star trainee with a bandage around his head fell, his stomach torn open. Kate panicked and tried to run. A rebel, one with orange gemstones, took 2 short steps and slammed the butt of his gun into the back of her head. She dropped to the ground. Maybell's heart clenched with fear. She started toward her friend when something hard pressed into the small of her back. Don't, a female voice, shallow and muffled, said. She froze. Part of her wanted to ignore the order, regardless of the weapon currently jutting against her spine. Her gaze was still fixed on Kate's form. Her friend stirred, and Maybell let out the breath she'd been holding. Don't move, the woman said again. I don't want to shoot you. Around them, the rest of the medical unit was being held at gunpoint. The young man with dark hair, his gun slung across his shoulder, poked the dead unit commander with his foot. Did you hear him? The boy sneered. Gray stars before black stars, he said in a crude yet accurate impression of the dead man. What a piece of shit. That's enough. A voice, one that reminded Maybell of deep caverns and dark trenches, carried through the air. She looked to its owner, and her pulse, already thundering with fear, sped up. The man was a mountain, tall and broad, with dark cargo pants, thick boots, and a black shirt decorated with the red handprint of the rebels, though his had 2 white lines painted across the 4 fingers. Twin green gemstones glistened against his temples, in sharp contrast to his dark red hair, which had been cut short on the sides and left longer at the top. The hair on his head matched a full beard, which hung down to his chest, as well as the curly strands which could have been mistaken for sleeves on his arms. In one massive hand, he clenched a 3-foot-long blade, serrated on one side, the darkened color of wet metal. In the other, he held a plasma gun. Small red netting covered both his nostrils. He strode toward the dark-haired man, an annoyed look on his face. Put your mask on. What are you thinking? The younger man did as he was told, pulling out a sheer red device about the size of Maybell's palm and fitting it over his nose and mouth. With a glance, Maybell realized each of the rebels had some form of netting or mask covering their faces. She frowned. a thought attempting to force its way through the fear muddling her brain. Get them moving. I don't like being out in the open, the man with the red beard said. The weapon at her back nudged her forward. She let it move her toward the trees, but when they drew level with Kate, she dropped and scurried to her friend. The woman behind her gave a shout of surprise, and footsteps sounded in her wake. The man who had knocked Kate to the ground raised his gun. Maybelle didn't care. She reached her friend and grabbed Kate's thin hand. Slender fingers weakly squeezed her own. Maybelle brushed a hand across her forehead. It came away wet with blood. Kate was alive. She was breathing. Maybelle pulled her up, putting an arm around her waist and straightening. The woman who had followed her stared grimly at them both. She was a white star. Pearly gemstones glinted against her tanned skin. Short, with blonde hair and an oval face, she too wore a red mask across her nose and mouth. Maybelle fixed her with a hard glare. Let's go, the woman gestured with her gun. They followed the rest of the rebels and the remaining gray stars into the trees. Kate gained coherence as they walked, eventually leaning less on Maybelle for support and more for comfort. Shudder after shudder ran through Maybelle. So many bodies, so many dead. And they were next. She'd heard the stories, the rumors, the detailed accounts of what happened when the rebels took prisoners. It was rare. Those who fell on the battlefield died where they lay, left for the scavengers. Those unfortunate civilians who got in their way were left for their families to find. The last she'd heard of Gray Stars taken prisoner involved torture, imprisonment, and ultimately a cruel and horrible death. They're going to kill us, Kate mumbled. Her voice shook with gasping breaths. Her body trembled. Maybelle tightened her grip around Kate's waist. No, they aren't. They would have done it back there. Kate's charcoal gray eyes, wide and bloodshot, met Maybelle's lighter ones. Then what? They stopped. The rebels had found a clear space between the trees. The 3 remaining gray stars were already lined up on their knees. Maybelle and Kate were led to the far end and shoved to the ground. Maybelle took the opportunity to check Kate's head. The jagged cut about the length of her thumb ran along her hairline. It was shallow, though blood still pooled and dribbled from the edge. They waited on their knees on the damp ground as a few of the rebels, including the large man, Redbeard, spoke in hushed tones a few yards away. The rest of the rebel group, almost a dozen men and women, watched the prisoners, weapons at the ready. The women wore their hair cropped short or in tight braids with strands falling around their weary faces. The men's clothes were patched and frayed, covered in dirt and blood. Hard hands held guns, axes, and knives. Gemstones, white, orange, green, and even purple, glistened against dark tan and pale temples. They turned as one when Redbeard walked toward the gray stars, his hand on his gun. We need to get moving. He looked at the people on their knees. Cooperate, and we won't hurt you. The gray star at the end of the line, a man older than Maybelle and Kate, who had been friends with the unit commander, gave a derisive snort. Redbeard faced him. Something to say? The older man struggled to his feet, the contempt on his face palpable. A few of the rebels near them inched forward with wary expressions. The top of the gray star's head barely reached Redbeard's nose, but he faced the rebel nonetheless, head raised and teeth bared, and hands clenched into tight fists. We will never cooperate with murderers, cowards, and criminals. You aren't worth the time it takes to kill you. He spit. The blob of mucus and saliva landed with an audible splat on Redbeard's cheek. A gunshot rang through the air. The gray star's body dropped, and Kate screamed. Maybelle reached out a hand and grabbed Kate's. She tightened her fingers, pressing into the grooves between Kate's knuckles. After a moment of ragged breaths and terrified sobs, her friend returned the pressure. Redbeard turned, his expression livid, to the young rebel who had fired. What in the depths was that? The boy faltered under Redbeard's glare. The excited, victorious look melted into fear and regret. He spat at you. You proved him right. Hand off your weapon. I'll deal with you when we get back to base. He let out a sigh and ran a hand through his beard. His gaze drifted down, scanning the remaining 4 prisoners. Cold malice stared back at him from the eyes of the first 2 gray stars. Kate looked at the ground, tears still marking tracks down her cheeks. Maybelle met his gaze, holding it even as fear coursed through her body until he looked away. He gestured to the short blonde woman. Get the wounded and the prisoners loaded up. We've been here too long already. She gave a sharp jerk of the head. What about the dead? Leave them, he said, not meeting her eyes. She opened her mouth, but he held up a hand. I said, leave them. We don't have time. Her lip curled up in a snarl, but she didn't speak. The prisoners were moved, shoved through the forest for what seemed like an hour until they came upon a rocky dirt road. Maybelle kept her fingers locked in Kate's until the last possible moment when the rebels loaded them into transport trucks very similar to their own. Two older women searched them for weapons, bound their hands, and tied them to steel loops drilled into the bed of the truck. The rebels loaded the other two members of their unit into the second truck. Several people piled into the truck, sitting as far to the back and away from Maybelle and Kate as possible. Redbeard and the short woman joined them as well. The truck lurched forward. Maybelle swallowed, her eyes darted around, searching for a way out or at least something to look at to distract her mind from the horrible scenarios it kept playing out. They drove for hours. At a certain point, the adrenaline from the mayhem, death, and fear faded away. Maybelle struggled to keep her eyes open. Kate slumped against her shoulder, head lolling with every pothole and rock they drove over. Streaks of orange, red, and pink crisscrossed the western horizon by the time the truck pulled to a stop. If she had a better sense of direction, Maybelle may have been able to guess that their journey through the mountains led them north, and that though they had traveled for over half the day, they weren't nearly as far from the main Gray Star compound as it seemed. However, Maybelle's sense of direction barely told her where up was, and as far as she was concerned, they could have been halfway across the country for all it mattered. They would be dead soon, no matter which direction they'd gone. She and Kate were released from the truck. Their hands remained tied in front of them. They'd parked along the edge of a cleared-out space roughly the size of a small city block. Forest surrounded them. To the east, massive mountains climbed up, 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 their tips obscured by the clouds. To the west, dwindling light carved monstrous shadows from the trees. A building barely fit to be called such stood in the center of the clearing. There were 4 walls, a tin roof, 1 door, and no windows. Trucks, wooden boxes, fuel containers, weapons, and an assortment of other gear sat sprawled around the shed. Small clusters of warm bodies surrounded a dozen dugout fires. The chatter in the air died as Maybelle and Kate were pushed toward the small building. Several people stood and walked closer, gawking at them and murmuring to each other, hands going to their weapons. Anxiety grew in Maybelle as they approached the building. Her footsteps faltered. A gun dug into her lower back, and she picked up her pace. Kate's body shook next to her.